this is my summary of all of what I've been talking about in these last 2 or 3 sessions. Gentile believers are grafted into the olive tree of Israel, Romans 11, forming one unified people of God. One unified people of God. People, please, there's one gospel. This gospel of the kingdom is the gospel of salvation. I get pushback from the hyper dispensationalists who say the gospel of the kingdom is for Israel, and the gospel itself, without the word kingdom, is for the Gentile church. Meaning there's 2 gospels. One of them's Paul's, the other's Jesus, or something like that. And the gospel of the kingdom is for Israel to enter into a kingdom that God promised Israel, and to include, I guess, maybe rights to the land and access to the temple and participation in the animal sacrifices. The whole 9 yards is supposedly the somehow gospel of the kingdom. This is part of hyper-dispensationalism as far as I can tell. The answer is no. There's no separate gospel of the kingdom that's separate from the genuine gospel of salvation in Messiah. By grace are you saved through faith, not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. That's the gospel. And guess what? It is included in the gospel of the kingdom, or we could say the gospel of the kingdom and the gospel itself are one and the same gospel. We're just talking about an evolution of terminology, progressive revelation of terms that are mentioned in the Bible that culminate in the one gospel, but it includes the gospel of the kingdom, because Jew and Gentile will occupy that same kingdom on planet Earth during the millennium. That's my perspective. So Romans 11 has this olive tree, and this olive tree is Israel, or the family of Israel, the visible family at that time, I believe, Abraham's offspring. And Paul masterfully explains to Gentiles who've been brought into a relationship with God through Messiah that they represented a wild olive tree that was taken and removed from their wild position and brought into this cultivated olive tree. That's Romans 11. And thus, they join the family of Israel without having to change their ethnicity into Israelites. But they do take on this designation Israel, although at a remnant level. So, believing Gentiles get incorporated in the family of God by faith, only by faith, and they maintain their position by faith. This is explained in Galatians 3, it's explained in Romans 4, and then culminates in Romans 11. And we also find in the same analogy of the olive tree, not only that Jew and Gentile are brought together in Messiah, but we also see some of the sequencing where Paul talks about that the Gentiles have to come to a fullness prior to the final salvation of national Israel. Because this tree that Abraham represents, Papa Abraham's family is comprised of, still has unbelieving Israelites that have been broken off in certain places, and they're laying on the ground. But Paul says they can be grafted back into their own tree again if they come to faith. And so this culmination of, or fullness of Gentiles coming to a zenith point will trigger the salvation of those Israelites that God has deemed should be part of national Israel or should be part of remnant Israel one day. But we have them in that order. Fullness of Gentiles comes first. Fullness of the final salvation of Israel comes second. And thus, all people groups will then be part of God's family the way they should be. Does this mean every single Israelite will be saved? I don't think so. But every Israelite at that time that God designates as part of his people will be, meaning all that he has called unto salvation. Let's keep reading. When Jesus speaks of gathering his elect in Matthew 24, the language mirrors rapture texts like 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians. And again, don't get confused. If you find one verse that clearly by context seems to be describing either an event or a truth, that somewhere else in the Bible does not have all of the exact details everywhere. There's a poetry in the Bible, and the context allows for the poetry in one place to use one set of language and to be complemented by another passage describing the same truth or theology or event in a poetic way so that it complements the first reference. And so we don't have to have exact language in each place. Sometimes we have a direct quote from a place out of the Bible, like a New Testament writer will quote the Old Testament, And sometimes that allows for exact wording from Old Testament to New. And we do see that. And then it gives us more of an assurance that we're looking at the same event or talking about the same theology, et cetera, et cetera. But more often than not, the Bible uses complementary terminology to help us build the context, like looking at something from multiple angles. And those different angles fill out this bigger picture of the symmetry of whatever it is we're looking at. We can say poetry is a way of looking at the different angles where we have different words to describe the same event or the same theology. We could also simply just recognize that there are different verbs and nouns and adjectives describing single events, but they don't have to be the exact same words used by every author. God didn't simply pull out a cookie cutter and everywhere he wanted to talk about the same event, he didn't just stamp it right there so that we have the exact duplicate of words to assure us. And in end-time prophecy, this features prominently. That's why you cannot get tripped up on saying, well, passage A has this word, and I know that it's talking about event A, and then passage B has a different word, and so this leads me to believe that it's the event B. You don't have to do that. You can actually, by context, determine that event A and event B are the same event. They're just one event. They're just in passage A and passage B described by two different authors in two different ways, two different sets of terminology and nomenclature, but it's the same unified event by context. Okay, let's keep going. So we can see this in rapture passages. We can see where one author will emphasize one detail and then another author will identify or emphasize a different angle or aspect, but it's the same event. For instance, Yeshua in some places doesn't talk about resurrection. For instance, in his Olivet Discourses, he doesn't seem to talk about resurrection per se. He just talks about kind of rapture events. Paul then, by comparison, in his Thessalonian Corinthians passages, talks heavily about resurrection, and rapture seems to be kind of downplayed a little bit. But I can assure you they're the same event, because Paul brings in enough information for us to know that they are the same. When we get to the book of Revelation, likewise, there are some passages that seem to only focus on either resurrection, but don't use the word rapture. And we're left scratching our head going, are these the same event? So likewise, there are signs that accompany this magnificent event, this tremendous rapture/resurrection, which is a huge event. The sixth seal sign, cosmic disturbances, are one of those signs. They go all the way back to the Old Testament books of Joel and Isaiah, and I believe there's some in Zechariah or Zephaniah, one of those places. But let's just focus on Joel and Isaiah. Joel 2 and Isaiah chapter 13, to be exact. They talk about these cosmic signs that involve the sun, the moon, the stars. And then when we get to the apostolic scriptures in the book of Luke, we even bring in the earthquakes and the waves and things like that. Book of Revelation also echoes the earthquakes, if I remember. But the point being is that we can put all those passages together on the table and notice that there are some slight differences in minute details, such as the description of the sun, description of the moon, the color that it turns. One passages have them being dark. Another passage has the moon being red, blood red, things like that. One passages say the sun and moon actually turn into darkness. Another one says they simply look dark, something to that effect. Does this mean they're separate events? No, I don't believe they are separate events. There is one proper event that I believe these are all pointing to, which is an event that triggers the resurrection/rapture. Are there other times in the narrative where the sun acts and behaves oddly? Absolutely. Are those all to be equated as the same event as that one significant sixth seal sign event? No, I don't believe so. So don't get confused. That'd be like saying that every time I looked outside and saw a solar eclipse, that would be what Jesus was talking about in the Bible. Well, clearly that can't be the case. Every solar event in history is not the sixth seal event described by the Bible, Joel and Isaiah and Yeshua and the book of Revelation. That's not what's going on every time I see a solar eclipse. Likewise, every time I see a lunar eclipse, it's not the sixth seal that I'm looking at. So we need to understand context, all right? The Bible lets us know that we're looking at the same event because there are other language that triggers it, such as things like this event is going to happen before the coming of the day of the Lord, something like that. All right, so let's go back to my text here because I'm kind of wandering off the topic. Paul brings in this language here that mirrors Yeshua's language about the elect going into this tribulation period, culminating in a rapture/resurrection, or I should put them in the other direction, the other order, resurrection/rapture, because that's the time. And so it's the language of these mirror texts that lets us know that we're looking at one unified rapture. That's where I was kind of chasing the rabbit. And this refers to the rapture of the church, not a separate post-rapture event for Jews. Sabbath and geography, not theology. Matthew 24:20's warning about fleeing on the Sabbath refers to real-world challenges in Judea, not to Mosaic law or to the idea that only Jews are in view. This is such a weak argument. I don't even know why pre-tribbers even bother with it, but I do have to address it. It's a contextual concern, not a theological exclusion of the church, right? It just makes common sense, right? Use common sense. Is Israel are Israelites in the land of Israel observing Sabbath laws? Yes, they are. Are church-going Christians around the world observing Mosaic and Sabbath laws? By and large, no, they aren't. However, when the time comes for the 70th week events to transpire, surely there will be people in Israel that will be involved in this event. In fact, to be sure, it's those who are in Israel that will be at the epicenter of what's going on. Understand what I mean? The 70th week events, the so-called 7-year tribulation events, where we talk about the kicking off at the midpoint with the Great Tribulation. So if I go back over to my slides here, you can see we've got the midpoint with the Great Tribulation in our pre-trib rapture. In the mid-trib, we also have a midpoint where there is something significant that takes place in the middle of the 3.5 years. The post-trib has the same feature. The midpoint is right smack dab in the middle. And then the Prewrath rapture, we also have our midpoint in the middle. So all of us are in agreement, all of us historic premillennialists who hold to a 7-year time frame. We have our differences on what the names of the sections are, but we all have the same midpoint. And it's that midpoint that allows us to be unified in terms of activities such as the Antichrist taking his place in the temple per Paul's instructions and warnings in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The Antichrist takes his seat in that temple and decides to turn the entire world's attention to himself, declaring himself to be God, demanding the world's worship, unifying all of the commerce of the world under some mark system that prevents anyone who doesn't have the mark from buying, selling, trading, doing business, etc., whatever you want to call it. In that scenario, we don't need to believe that some people in the land of Israel observing Sabbath laws are suddenly somehow exempted or different than people in another part of the world who are not observing Sabbath laws. Simply put, when the Antichrist rears his ugly head and he reveals himself, and I believe this is the moment of his revealing, then it will be incumbent upon those who are at the epicenter of his revealing, which Paul said will be in the temple, some form of rebuilt temple that is not sanctioned by God. So it's an unsanctioned temple, albeit it's one that blind Israelites will believe is sanctioned by God, right? So don't get confused. They believe it's God's temple, but we Christians know that it will be an unsanctified, it'll be an abominable temple. So there's no need for us to attend worship there. We can just sit this one out, wait for the genuine holy temple to be rebuilt by Yeshua in the millennium. Right, but back to this ungodly temple, this unsanctified temple. I just call it Antichrist temple, really. It says takes its place in the temple. This activity will have its epicenter in Israel because that's where the temple must be built. There's no other location on planet Earth where the temple can be genuinely recognized as located and be authentic. Has to be there in the temple, or has to be there in Jerusalem. Might even be on top of the Temple Mount next to that already abominable edifice known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The location of the temple is debated, but generally speaking, I'm of the opinion that it's where the Dome of the Rock sits now, somewhere in that vicinity on Temple Mount. It's up there. That Temple Mount area is where I believe the temple used to stand, which is why having that Muslim edifice up there right now is such a shame, such a tragedy. Nevertheless, that's the epicenter. That's where the activities are going to start or originate, they'll spill out into the rest of the world. But my point in bringing this up is that when we go back over to my essay, when Yeshua warns those who are reading these words that if your flight has to take place on a Sabbath, that you're going to have a problem, he's simply using common sense to refer to real world challenges for people who are in that part of the world where Sabbath laws are enforced. This doesn't mean he's making a theological statement about who is the elect, right? Use your thinking brain, please. Let's keep going. Why Tribulation Saints only doesn't hold up. Let's keep going. I've got about 10 minutes left. I'm probably just going to finish out this summary. And then what you'll see is there's a conclusion, and I might read that, and then I'm going to stop at the excursus down there below. So let's keep going. Why does Tribulation Saints present problems? Why doesn't it hold up? The Pretrib view that Tribulation Saints are a new class of believers after a Pretrib rapture creates theological problems. It divides the body of Messiah into two groups without biblical support. Revelation consistently calls tribulation believers saints, the same term used for the church. Prewrath affirms that all believers before and during the tribulation are one body, saved by one gospel, indwelt by the same Spirit, and gathered together at the return of Messiah before the day of the Lord begins. Are you beginning to see it? There's no need to create a second class of citizens that are saved but are not allowed to wear the label church. This is just ludicrous. I don't understand. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I've got a whole excursus that goes into this, so forget about what I was just rambling on. Let's actually dip into the conclusion. I've got 8 minutes left, and I think I can hit this. So, what's the conclusion to this segment? In conclusion, give me a second. I want my highlighting to look like that. There we go. In conclusion, the Prewrath view offers a more cohesive understanding of the identity of the elect in Matthew 24 and across the New Testament. By the way, just because as a Prewrather, I believe that the identity of the elect in Matthew 24 is demonstrated to be both Israel and the church on different levels, right? National Israel is the elect of God, and Gentile believers are the elect of God. Gentile nationals who don't believe in Jesus and aren't a part of Israel are not part of the elect, right? Remember my little Venn diagram with the two circles. I'll flash it in post-production again so you can see it. You're looking at it right now. See that circle there? See the two circles there? See the almond slice in the middle, right? Memorize that. Take a picture of it. Okay. The fact that Prewrath holds to this position that I'm talking about, let me jump back over to my slides here. This doesn't prove that Prewrath is the one that's the only correct position. I hold to this position, Prewrath, but it's not because we believe that the elect of Matthew are Jews and Gentiles brought into Messiah, that this is proof that the Prewrath position is accurate. Because in reality, if I go backwards a view, the post-tribbers believe the same thing. Notice in their view, the church goes through the wrath of God, goes through the wrath of Satan, goes through the tribulation, goes through the great tribulation. They're protected by God supernaturally, right? There's this whole Goshen principle going on where God supernaturally protects his people, all the while raining down fire and brimstone on the wicked people. God can do that. He's powerful enough to do that. I don't put that past him. It absolutely could happen, right? I don't believe it needs to happen because I've already got passages that describe a rapture, which explains how God's people are protected. I don't need to enter into speculation or supposition about a Goshen principle that was enacted somewhere else in the Bible that suddenly has to happen again in the eschatological end times, right? But nevertheless, the principle is still there. God's people go into tribulation, but they are rescued from God's wrath. Unless you're a post-tribber, then you believe that God's people have to tough it out through the entire thing. They're sheltered in place. But the point I'm trying to bring up is that the post-tribbers, like we pre-wrathers, also believe that the elect of Yeshua's Olivet Discourses is the church and Israel at the same time. So you don't have to be a pre-wrather to believe what I'm talking about when it comes to this identity of the elect. So again, let me go back to the slide I forgot to mention. It's only when we go backwards to the mid-tribbers who feel the need to remove the church, quote unquote, from the Great Tribulation because they believe the church, quote unquote, cannot be part of this, what we would call Jacob's trouble time frame, things like that. You remember the pre-tribbers are leaning too heavily on dispensationalism. By the way, as I mentioned dispensationalism, I'm going to throw Robert Van Kempen on the, I'm sorry, not Robert Van Kempen. Yeah, him or Marv Rosenthal. Now I'm getting confused which one. I think it might be Robert Van Kempen. He also admits, I watched a video, very old video. It was like VHS quality video. I believe it was him. It might have been Marv Rosenthal, but I'm pretty sure it was Van Kempen, the one who's one of the fathers of the Prewrath position. He talks in the video about he is a dispensationalist. And so I thought to myself, I can't just throw dispensationalism completely out. There are some truths that dispensationalism brings to the table that are rock solid. One of these days I'll do a study on that, and then you'll begin to understand that I'm not anti-dispensationalist. I just understand that there's a flavor of dispensationalism that I disagree with. So I thought I'd mention that to you. But nevertheless, mid-tribbers is still a dispensational view, and they have to remove the church from entering into the Great Tribulation. So therefore, for them, the elect of Matthew 24, I believe, they would hold to the idea that the elect in Matthew in the Olivet Discourses cannot be the church. Likewise, of course, for picking on the pre-trib position, they're the ones that started this whole discussion, for me at least. They absolutely do not believe that the elect of Yeshua's Olivet Discourses is the church. So going back to my conclusion. In conclusion, the Prewrath view offers a more cohesive understanding of who the identity of these people are. I say that rather than limiting the elect to ethnic Israel or proposing a new group of tribulation saints, Prewrath recognizes the elect as the unified people of God, both Jewish and Gentile believers in Messiah. And you just have to let context tell you which people group is in view. And when we're talking about elect, that label seems to be exclusive to either Christians who've been brought into the people group of God at the level of faith, right, via faith in Messiah, not any other way. So elect allows for that label to apply to them. But at the same time, elect has always applied to Israel, whether they believe in Jesus or not. This seems like a double standard. Christians do not get to wear the label elect until they believe in Jesus, but Jews don't have to believe in Jesus and yet are still allowed to wear the label elect. How is it possible? It's because the elect, by and large, refers to God's people at the level that God has chosen them for specific purposes on planet Earth. So when God singled out Israel away from the Gentile nations for his plans and purposes, at that moment, they took on the label elect, the exact same way that Abraham got singled out by God for God's purposes and therefore is the father of the elect. Make sense? The Gentile peoples who were not singled out by God for special purposes do not get to wear the label elect. You must be either Abraham or part of Abraham's offspring, either at the natural level or at the spiritual level, to wear the label elect. This is the way I understand the Bible to be speaking. So that's why, if you're looking at the label elect, then it's exclusive to Abraham's offspring, both natural and spiritual, but excludes anyone else. However, if we look at the word saints and the word church, we have some other similarities between those two, but sometimes we're focusing on the group of people who, by today's standards, exclusively believe in Jesus versus those parts of Abraham's offspring who do not believe in Israel. That's where we have some differences. Okay, I need to create another Venn diagram that shows the elect of Israel and the, perhaps maybe the, well, no, we can't create a Venn diagram that does that, because if you believe in Jesus and you're Jewish, then you're going to go when the rapture happens. You're not going to be left behind as far as I can make out. It's only those Israelites who are not yet rapture ready, who are still going to be part of God's program and plan one way or another. Will they be saved? They might. They could be. They believe in Jesus. But either way, a place of protection waits for them, because Jesus said, if you're in Jerusalem, flee. And the 1,260 days is allotted for Israelites. Okay, let's keep going. In other words, it's not designated for the church. So this idea of elect, including the people groups of God that are both Jew and Gentile, and the believers in Messiah are those who are part of the rapture group of the elect, remnant Israel. Then I go on to say that this reflects the apostolic teaching of a single olive tree into which all who believe are grafted, without denying Israel's continued significance in God's redemptive plan. I do not hold to, I can't remember what Pastor John Hagee's form of heresy is, where he believes that there are two plans of salvation, one for God's people, Israel, and a different plan for the Gentiles. This seems to feed into the either replacement theology, supersessionism theology, hyper-dispensationalism theology. I don't know what John Hagee's error is, and I am calling him out. I am naming him by name, Pastor John Hagee. Everyone knows who he is. If you don't know who he is, then Google search him. Hagee, I believe, Hagee. He's got a real intense love for Israel. He's a Zionist, to be sure, and I appreciate that in his messages. However, as far as I understand, he's been called out by other public leaders publicly, so that's why I'm not shying away from doing this myself. I'm not slandering a brother just for the sake of slander. But if I am correct, and I believe I'm correct, and I'll double check myself this week and come back next week and offer a retraction and an apology if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct. He believes that Israel has a place of salvation that's separate from the salvation that's required of all men who are not part of Israel. So he's believing in two ways of salvation. In the end, he's talking about two different gospels. And so that's not what I'm describing in my discussion about who the elect is and things like that. So please don't get confused. Don't send me comments and say that I'm teaching the same nonsense as John Hagee. I'm not doing that. Let's keep reading. Prewrath also rightly interprets Jesus' warning about the Sabbath in Matthew 24:20 as a practical regional concern for Judea, not as a theological boundary marker separating Jews from Gentile believers. This is part of my conclusion. That's why it looks like there's some overlapping information or repeating information. Of course there is. It's a conclusion, right? We talked about this already. I'm just reading the conclusion so you can follow along. So this idea of Jesus warning people in his Olivet Discourse is that if it's a Sabbath day, you're going to run into problems, and that it's obvious that the church does not observe Sabbath laws. The fact that this interpretation is purported to be proof that Jesus is talking to national Israelites and not to the church is extremely weak for a number of reasons, the ones I've already shown you. But suffice to say, it's a practical regional warning, has nothing to do with theology. The consistent language of saints throughout Revelation, I go on to say, confirms that God's people remain on earth during the Great Tribulation and are not divided into separate classes based on timing. And so my final paragraph, I say is that ultimately, Prewrath holds one gospel, one spirit, one unified gathering of the elect at the return of Christ. Those who are rapture ready when Christ comes for the resurrection and rapture, which is post-tribulation, post-great tribulation, but not post-wrath of God, according to my sequencing. This is the group that will go when the time comes for a rapture/resurrection. By comparison, national unbelieving Israel will still be in hiding. Jesus will necessarily need to do some traipsing around the Middle East to scoop up Israelites hiding here and there, meeting them face to face, culminating and bringing them to a place. I don't have all the details in this, but I'll get into it a different day. Culminating and bringing them to a place of salvation, possibly somewhere close to Jerusalem. I'm not quite sure where this might take place on earth, but it won't take place in heaven, because the Israelites won't have been raptured then. National Israelites, 2/3 of which are going to die in the hands of at the hands of Antichrist, as far as I can tell from Zechariah. But the point being is that this third that's brought through the fire will be refined, and at that point in time, they will be ready to meet their Messiah. there won't be a need for a rapture as far as I can tell. In other words, I don't believe in multiple raptures, which would necessitate another resurrection if that's the case, because rapture and resurrection are the same event. So I don't believe there's a second rapture. Therefore, I don't believe there's, let me say it a different way. I don't believe there's a second resurrection there. A second resurrection of believers. There is, in fact, a second resurrection, but it's a resurrection of unbelievers at the end of the 1,000 years. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about some time of salvation of Israel near the end of the 70th week, near the 7th trumpet, but prior to the 30 days that should occupy the bowl judgment. So Israel needs to be saved right around the end of the 7th week for all of prophecy to come to a conclusion, Daniel's 7th week to draw to a proper consummation. And the end of all things, Jesus Christ officially reclaims reign over planet Earth. The mystery of God comes to a conclusion. This other language that we see in the book of Revelation. But the point being is that all of that takes place near the end of the 7th week. And if you remember from my slide here for the Prewrath Rapture, which is here, that means if I blow up this part of my slide, I'm talking about the Prewrath Rapture taking place sometime in the middle of, during the second half of the 7th week, but the Israel salvation taking place closer to what you see at that second down arrow, which is near the end of the week. In other words, let me say it in a way that you probably have never heard before. Israel's salvation and the Battle of Armageddon are separated by a month. Israel's salvation being the end of the 7th week, the end of the 7 years of Daniel's 70 weeks. That would be the salvation of Israel right there. That's not to be confused with the raptures, which took place at the very least 5 months earlier, but possibly even a year and 5 months earlier, but at least 5 months. But Israel would get saved near the end of the 70th week at the 7th trumpet, not to be confused with Paul's last trumpet, but 7th trumpet, Israel's salvation. And then 30 days later, over the span of 30 days, the bowl judgments are poured out on Satan's Antichrist kingdom, culminating in the Battle of Armageddon at the end of that 30 days, so the end of the bowl judgments. What happens to Israel during that time? They must also be supernaturally protected. So, you believe it or not, I actually do have some Goshen principle stuff going on there. So, in my conclusion here, ultimately, Prewrath upholds one gospel, one spirit, one unified gathering of the elect at the return of Christ. So that's the rapture. But then there is a salvation of Israel later than the rapture, and yet they are still the people of God. It's just that there are differing programs as to where the salvation of the church, the rescuing of the church takes place versus the salvation of Israel. And the big difference is obvious. It should be in our face. The church at this point in time, the true church, we're already rapture ready. Israel, by comparison, is far from being rapture ready at this point in time. They still have to go through some refinement. Don't get me wrong, the Great Tribulation, by and large, is the refinement of the church, separating the genuine believers from the fakers, right, from those who are Christian in name only. So continuing in my conclusion, then I'll draw our study to a close and stop parked at the excursus there that I keep peeking at. The view that I'm purporting avoids the unnecessary complications and theological inconsistencies introduced by the, quote, tribulation saints only, quote unquote, model in pre-trib theology. Just throw that label out. Okay? Maybe I'll make that the thumbnail for this particular video. Throw that label out. Sounds so impacting, right? Just doesn't work. Tribulation saints only. Give me a break. That particular label is the weakness of their, is one of their weaknesses of their model. And I go on to say, in conclusion, it maintains the integrity, the view that I'm purporting right now, maintains the integrity of the church's identity and honors the biblical sequence of end-time events. And so that's where I'm done with this particular part. Next week, here's what I'm going to look at. Excursus 1. Why are so-called tribulation saints needed in the first place? Right? We're going to look at why would pre-tribbers introduce this phantom term if there wasn't so much at stake. There must be something driving their need to bring in a term that doesn't exist in the Bible and whip up an imaginary group of people. I say imaginary. The people are really there. There really are believers in the tribulation. There really are believers in the last 7 years, but they're not called tribulation saints if your terminology is separating them from a church that got raptured 7 years earlier. That's what I mean by tribulation saints. I believe there will be Christians during the 7 years and during the Great Tribulation, etc. So if you want to say that we're tribulation saints, well, okay, that kind of works, but this is a specialized term that was invented by the Pretribbers, and so they have the right to define their term, and they believe that this is a group of people that's separate from the church that got raptured at the beginning of their so-called 7-year sequence. So next week, I'll turn into this excursus. Why are so-called tribulation saints needed in the first place? But that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.